Hi, everyone, and welcome to Precog time. This is our 16th episode, which is unbelievable, but we're really happy to have a conversation with LorenBritton and Isabel Paehr, who are joining us from Berlin. And they work together as a collaborative, is that what you call yourselves? A collaborative called Melt, and have recently made a long sort of video work which spreads outward into public talks like this one and workshops called Meltionary, thinking about the concept of melting as a material metaphor, which is useful for aesthetic and political thinking. So we're excited to get into that with them. And before we start getting into it, our first question is always usually, how have you been experiencing quarantine, and what has life been like for you in Berlin, especially now as things begin to open up a little bit?
You want to start?
Okay. So yeah, I've been in Berlin throughout this time, and usually I travel quite a lot, so that has been a big change in my routine, but also sort of forced me to be at home for, I think, the longest time ever. So that has also been interesting. And yeah, I guess now shops, but also some institutions are slowly opening up again. Also, I potentially could work at my indie co-working space for games, but I don't feel like it's such a good idea right now. So it's a bit of an in-between state, actually, of this opening, and yet still a lot of concerns, a lot of people also still being very affected by this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess the quarantine, exactly. The quarantine has mostly lifted in Berlin. In a lot of ways, there's still lots of mask wearing going on and things like that, but it's been more open. I think I'm in an interesting position as being from the US, but living in Germany. So I feel like my kind of psyche has been split in different ways throughout this time. We're thinking very much about what it is to be in the US and realizing that my embodied circumstances are a little bit different being here. So yeah, I don't know, maybe lots of people have this perspective, but I've almost thought about it as a kind of rear window time. Like, I have my studios in my home right now, and I have lots of theories about what my neighbors are up to because everyone's home at the same time. So that's been very much my experience of quarantine, is wondering what my neighbors are doing.
Yeah, I know, all of us, it's sort of like peeking through each other's windows here. So I wanted to ask you to begin, because both of you have independent creative practices and also different collaborative practices with others. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the work that you're doing outside of your work together, and then also give us a little bit of background as to how and why you decided to start working together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe we talk about individual practices, and then
sure, we can talk about how they came together.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. Yeah, so my practice is really very collaborative these days. I work in a few different collaborations, both with Izzy, but also with the Oracle working group. I also work as a researcher in a lab in Kassel University. And I also have my own artistic practice where I've been looking at a lot of been really looking at zooids recently, which are these underwater sea creatures that are kind of like a metaphor for collectivity, is how I've been thinking about them. So I think that, like my practice oscillates in between being more like research-based in my like reading, but mostly is always in collectivity. So that, I'm a little tongue-tied, but that's, it's a very natural way for me to work, to think in collectivity. You want to talk about what you've been?
Yeah, so I mostly work as an interdisciplinary designer, also often collaboratively. So on the one hand side, I work as a game designer, working on my own experimental games, and that fills like half of my week. And then I also have a similar position as Loren, as a researcher, mostly researching internet infrastructure and networks. I'm currently really into submarine cables for internet, and how they're like made materially, but also how a lot of what we imagine as immaterial, as like this Zoom call or generally computery things, actually is like very, very and deeply material. And also work with, for example, one collective called Fuzzy Binaires, where we organize interdisciplinary workshop weeks together. So I also like bringing people with different knowledges together, or like just meeting them and working with others, which is also, I guess, why we, I don't know, felt excited to work together, as we both like have that as an integral part of what we do.
Yeah, and of our practices.
Yeah.
So Izzy and I met through a reading group. At the time I was living in Kassel, and Izzy was also, and it's called TBD, or To Be Defined, which is a reading group in between technofeminism and, well, I guess it's between technofeminism and science and technology studies, I guess I would say. And we started with talking about messes. So I've been like preoccupied with messes for a while as something that are not equally distributed, like who gets to be a mess, who gets to make a mess, what does it mean to be messy? And this is something that's inherently political and also not equally distributed. And so this is a conversation that I was talking about with anyone that would talk with me about it. And Izzy and I had a really great conversation where we talked about how messes also related to meshes as well.
Yeah, so that was something I had been working on for a while, how like meshes as in 3D structures are supposedly clean, or you have also to clean them up. And then also how theorists like Wendy Hoikyung Chan, for example, speak of the work computers do to clean up after their users. And so this idea of digital computational cleanliness, and then also like actual mess making, like when that came together in our conversations, the like starting point.
Yeah, and that's where kind of melt or working on melting came from, actually.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through then how, what the project is, like what MELT is and what the Meltionary is, and maybe just a brief introduction, and then we can watch a short clip from the beginning of the video.
Yeah, totally. So MELT, I guess, is our kind of like duo name that we've taken on these days. And the Meltionary is something that we're slowly building in collaboration over time. So in our Meltionary, we have different meltries, as in entries. So we're playing with a lot of these ideas around definition and undefinition, and thought to do this, like through mostly collaborative experiments is how it's been so far. So we have a collaboration that we're working on with a friend to make a manual for warming up. So like a kind of warming up and melting down practice. And these are a series of embodied exercises that we've been doing. We also have been doing quite some wordplay or thinking through different ways of languaging as well. Do you want to add some more?
Yeah, so I think, generally we thought about like melting very literally, how the Earth's poles are melting, for example. And so there already are these transitional processes everywhere, yet language often like tends to stick to the stable or supposedly stable. And this was sort of our anchor, where we were like, what can we melt? Let's see.
Yeah, and this is also maybe what we say when we mean when we say that we take things very literally. So like we are literally like working on melting like the stuff which you will also see in the video clips as well. And it's kind of like material process to literally see what happens. And that's something that we're working on as a kind of method for our work.
Great. So I'm gonna share a little, the very beginning of the Meltionary, just so we can sort of use it as a visual reference, and then we'll watch some more clips as we continue to talk.
Cool.
Give me just 1 second. All right. you can see like my my YouTube history is all like makeup tutorials and the news. Sorry, my computer is a little bit sad right now. Okay, 1 second. I'm gonna just try that one more time. It sort of didn't work very well. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Hey, Izzy, H2O is the formula for water, but what's the formula for ice?
What is it?
H2O cubed. Configuration, configuration.
Melting is a shape-shifting configuration that changes things and ideas and forms and processes it comes into contact with.
About words. Nothing is really separate, and yet most things are constructed as such, separate in language. We live on a planet that is literally, there's little language available exploring instability. We practice not just saying the thing, we belabor the point of coming to a word or inventing a new word to be specific. We are playing with a more confusing way of saying things that embraces more situatedness and is moving towards a non-linear melted expression. Our language oozes like this, with molecular structures.
Melting does the work of entangling, of not giving up connections, and of shape and state change. Melting does the work of making murky and interlinking molecular structures while the way they are connected to each other is reformulated by the effects of heat. Some materials change shape to an extent that when seeing the material before and after melting, there are little similarities. Other materials seem to remember their shapes and snap back into them with ease. This is the result of a chemical state change.
Dissolving states both in theory and as a
All right. I think maybe that's okay for now, just as an intro.
Okay.
I wanted to ask how, what you're hoping to achieve and why you're interested in literal metaphors as a way of structuring thought and also as a way of engaging materiality. Also, I guess before answering that, Caroline wanted to know whose idea it was with the googly eyes in the eyes.
That's a very direct question.
You know.
But funnily, we had both already worked with
googly eyes. Yeah,
So.
It's a shared interest.
Yeah. Just around.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So to the question.
Yeah, exactly.
I think taking things literally to us points to materiality. And I would say that, and others have said that as well, that especially in regards to computation, there's this trope of immateriality. Like it's oftentimes supposed that bits, for example, are somehow immaterial, or that the internet is somehow immaterial. And this moving away from materiality also makes it really hard to talk about redistribution, for example. Because if the internet was not material, how then
would you redistribute it?
Yeah. So this idea of starting from material and not from metaphor or like supposed meaning in language, I think allows us to get a bit closer to that point. And to also explore what actually happens on a material level and what else could potentially happen.
Yeah. I think it's also like an interest in tracking when working with materials as seen in the video, it's like an interest in tracking state changes as well. So I think that it's a lot about not presuming what will happen, but beginning with the question and then seeing what happens with the materials that we end up working with as well. So I think there's also this interest in charting that both computationally, also with the materials, and also in terms of thinking about climate change or climate crisis, as it can be called. I think that the crisis narrative of things assumes that it was never there before. And I think that a larger material project is to look at how change changes over time and is ongoing and never just happens. It is like processual. So I think that that's also part of this interest in focusing on material and taking things as taking things quite literally when people say something and not going towards abstraction as the first mode. Yeah.
Right. In some ways, as I was watching the video, I was thinking about like, how the idea of a hyperobject has become like really colloquialized, stemming from Timothy Morton's idea that there are some structures which are too large conceptually and literally for us to be able to visualize because they're occurring kind of beyond our frame of reference almost. Or conception of time and space, but that like we have to sort of we have to be able to pick up the evidence of these objects almost like symptomatically as they appear materially in the world, or like weather, for instance, is a good example of a quote unquote hyperobject or something like this, and climate change would also be. And so I wonder, one of the things that I was wondering about, especially in relation to materiality in this video, is that you, in some ways, there's like the emphasis on both states of material and the processes of change, and kind of assuming ways of making likeness between those, right? Like, do all liquids behave in similar forms, right? Or should I be paying attention to whether water is liquid or solid, as opposed to paying attention to the characteristics of water per se? So that just turned into a weird ramble. But I guess my question is sort of how are you thinking about materials as opposed to materiality, maybe, or individualized materials versus a kind of understanding of materiality in relation to states of matter and also the processes of those states in becoming?
I think that, for example, water is very specific in what it makes possible and not. So if the melting point of water was slightly different, we would all have not exist probably.
Yeah.
So I think in that example, the specificity of this material is like it determines so much,
Yeah.
right? Whereas then pointing to materiality, or like maybe also conceptions of matter, also could allow to like broaden the thinking in some ways, or like to find commonalities on connections. But I would say that in our practice, we always have both, like the very specific item that we can also touch and play with and challenge, but also the notion of like towards larger concepts as like computation or chemistry or these things.
Yeah. I'll let Izzy answer that one. I think it's a good answer.
Totally. And I was also thinking about maybe if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between the words that you're using and your focus on language and languaging, and ideas about images or imaging, and how you think about the two. And I think that's it.
I guess also, like for me, English is not my first language. So it's also, as much as German, which is my first language, a very specific way of expressing things. Whereas imaging, I guess also in similar ways is, but also allows for different ways of working together on something that is not necessarily from the beginning mediated through a specific language and its possibilities.
Right. I feel like in both, I guess, like I feel very with I guess it's a funny question. I don't know if I think so much within imaging in our project. Like I need to think about how to think about that, or it's not a question that's been present with me. But I guess like these questions of languaging at the beginning of our project or ongoing, we continue to like play with materials and to try and describe them also as they're changing. And so we've done a few experiments where it's like, and what is it right now? And what is it just like now? And what is it now? And this is like when something is burning or heating up or like creating a lot of smoke, and like trying to track the kind of language that we think that comes to mind, like when something is rapidly changing, like how can we say something about it? And it's a kind of fun translation process, but then also very quickly the limits of language are met too, or we'll switch into sounds or to different languages or to like movements or something like this, trying to express the like literal phase transformations of what we're melting in that moment. And so I think that it's really kind of our engagement with language has been really about like trying to understand, like if we had a name for it with the things that we were melting, maybe we would then be able to say it because it'd be like, oh, it's that. But I think that as things are changing, it's not like that. It's like something that we don't know. And so that's the interest, I think, is as we've been playing with materials and melting them.
I mean, it's an interesting question, and we'll show another clip in a second, because you kind of use this model of a dictionary, which is itself like really prescriptive as like the holder and generator of languages and definitions, in relation to these sort of like almost tutorial, this imagery, which is sort of sourced from or relates to internet tutorials, like this is how you melt solder, like this is how you etch your own plate at home, right? And you sort of use these experiments as a way of building a network of connected ideas, like stretching from computation, which you will all see in just a minute, to like really a kind of like proposition for reimagining critical theory at large by the end of the video. And I was just wondering why the format of the dictionary felt so available, or what you think the opportunity is with the format of a dictionary and the format of a tutorial, almost on a visual side.
Yeah, I think like with the dictionary, it's also like what's included in the dictionary then determines what can be said as well. So there's also like a desire to push at the limit of what is included in that, like, and to make our own Meltionary as a kind of index of different things that we are working towards defining or non-defining. Like really, like I think this question of definition and what does definition mean is something that we're very much brushing up against and working with. Also as it relates to questions of categorical systems in general, or in like a larger sense as well, is something that we're working with and playing on. And what's the second part of the question? Do you remember?
Tutorials?
Yeah,
tutorials.
The aesthetic of the video.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so in the beginning, we looked into fun video, like YouTube videos as Will It Blend? So these are sort of tutorial-like. They are not as much visually enjoying what is done, as it's usually like dust or, I don't know, mud, ooze,
yeah,
what comes out of it, but more in a sort of sampling or material sampling.
Yeah.
And also there's like a certain joy of destruction,
exactly.
I would say.
Totally.
So that really spoke to us. And I think this is like what informed our aesthetic as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also like a way of non-visual knowing is also something that's in like these Will It Blend videos as well. So it's like the powder that is in like an iPhone that has been put in a Vitamix then is a powder. And if you test the powder, you can find which minerals are in it, which is quite interesting as well, because it turns out that there are things inside of our everyday technological objects that are not claimed to be inside there. And so this also opens up another sort of way of knowing or understanding what's inside of something that's also not necessarily visual, which is something else that, yeah, this is like another train.
Yeah, I totally didn't even know about Will It Blend videos, but I really like that there's an internet subculture devoted to seeing whether, like, what can go inside of a Vitamix.
Yeah.
The hydraulic press.
Oh, amazing. I'm gonna play another short clip that will get us into sort of the conversation around computation, which I know is sort of what you both have been focusing on in your research as well. So that'll be great to hear. And full screen again.
Electrical voltages are measured and then mapped to fit a scale from 0 to 1. But most of these numbers don't actually hit the 0 or 1 mark, but mostly exist in between. To ignore such noise, a threshold is put in place to fit a lot of different pulses into a binary logic. Within computation, zeros and ones can stand in for any other binary expression, such as true or false, signal, or ground. We argue that the fabrication of zeros and ones is an attempt to create stability in an unstable system, and that in fact, it's a huge labor on the part of the computer to keep up the reducing of very specific numbers to zeros and ones. Interruptions to the binary of bits happens in all sorts of queer ways in the universe. Cosmic rays cause trouble with electronics. As high energy protons and atomic nuclei, they move through space at the speed of light. According to a study from IBM in the 1990s, computers typically experience about 1 cosmic ray induced error per 256 megabytes of RAM per month. From this, we conclude that the universe is not okay with binary logic. Part 4.
What do you think? Is that a good place to start, or should we keep rolling for a second?
We could also watch 2 more minutes.
Yeah, maybe that would be nice.
Yeah, or 3.
Okay.
Whatever's good.
No, that's perfect.
Memory cells are refreshed in a rate of milliseconds to avoid leakage and thus data loss. The labor of keeping zeros and ones in place and from leaking is immense. We argue that leaking is not opposed to, but a core mode in computation. And align ourselves with Wendy Hoikang-Chun and Sarah Friedland, who write that new media are not about leaks, they are leak. Leaking is a process not bound to any particular field. It's a term in electronics, in data science, in chemistry, and in journalism that always points to an opening of a system or object. To stick to one example, Chelsea Manning was accused to have leaked documents and videos about war crimes committed by the US military in Iraq and Afghanistan to the platform WikiLeaks, a platform that carries the leak in its name. Despite the legal framework set up to contain such information, Manning released and leaked what she felt was wrong.
Scanning, Part 5. Photogrammetry is a 3D scanning technique in which one takes multiple images of an object, all captured from slightly different angles. The software then uses these images, and if available, their geolocations, to generate 3D models. When scanning ice cubes, we encountered some trouble. Most scanning apps on phones didn't even recognize the transparent ice cubes. Capturing something that shapeshifts and doesn't provide clear and stable outlines turned out to be almost impossible.
Keeping up the illusion of stability, of seamlessness, of clarity and cleanliness requires ongoing patches that distract from the melts, the leaks, the messes, glitches, and cracks. We're interested in how, on a very material level, the stories we are told about computation simply don't hold true. Computing is already non-binary, melted, toxic, incomplete, full of invisibilized labor to keep up appearances and hungry for change.
So I was wondering if after seeing that, which feels like a really good articulation of the ideas behind and inside of this project, if you could talk a little bit about like what your hopes are for computation and how it is that you think that these ideas translate into other parts of your life. Yeah, we'll leave that there for the time being.
Thanks for that question. It's so nice. Do you want to go, or do you want me to?
If you,
I think I have an answer. Yeah, I have so many hopes for computation that have to do with unthinking the exploitation that becomes embedded within so many technological objects. My hopes would be that I've been really focused on recently how a lot of technological infrastructures purposefully make it so that information about how they are constructed is difficult to access to an average user. And this is also something that I've been learning about myself. It's not something that I would say I'm an expert in, and I'm also questioning this idea of expertness, but that's a separate topic. But I am interested or hopeful or curious about what non-expert takes on transfeminist technoscience can be, how we can think through location-based services. So I think it's a really interesting moment that we're in right now when so much of our interpersonal communication has moved online. And I'm really curious about what type of technological infrastructures can we create that are actually for communities rather than from corporate sources. And so I think I watched a Zoom, or not a Zoom, actually really not a Zoom, like a talk yesterday by this scholar, Seda Gursis, who I'm quite inspired by. And she works with the transfeminist technoscience collective called Constant. And they really are talking about like, what does it mean to create technological infrastructures that are coded by the people who need them and set up so that the communities that need to be in touch can be, but that it's something that is not outsourced immediately as the first option. So I think that my hopes for computation are really about thinking through situatedness, thinking through materiality, and understanding how the computational objects that we have are deeply material, and then understanding how that changes our perspective of what we are working with, actually. Yeah. Izzy?
Yeah, so I think that like both history and present of computation is also very like vast and fascinating. So, and some things that we've been trying to do in our work is also to explore how computation maybe already is non-binary, how there are all these nuances and material conditions that don't fall into, for example, the logic of the binary. So I'm also interested in exploring what already is there. I think there are already also a few really cool programming communities. For example, in New York, you have the Recurse Center, for example. You also have the Red Hooks mesh network where people set up their own internet infrastructure. So I don't know, I'm always really hyped for these kinds of projects. Where people are like taking tech into their own hands, building their own systems for their own also needs and wishes.
In a way, I think, I'm happy that you opened the conversation in relation to this kind of like the sort of punny slip between meshes, and melts or something like this. Because it started, especially like the analogy of the blend video speaks to like the limitations in our thinking about composition or something like this. Like we assume that in order to understand what something is made of, we should be able to take it apart, right? Which is in some ways like profoundly uncreative, right? Like if you can run an iPhone through a blender and have a fuller understanding of what it's literally made of on a chemical level, like what kind of information does that give us that doesn't relate to like, oh, an iPhone is made of a circuit board, a screen, like this kind of software, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the idea of seeing melting and the idea of process change as an opportunity, right? I think in some ways, like being released from various binaries is a clear win in some ways on a metaphorical level, or maybe win is the wrong way of putting it, but it's a clear opportunity, right? But on the other hand, your framing of melt is in relationship to like the melting heat state of the planet as we currently exist on it. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how you find opportunity inside of the metaphor and the materiality, and how you extend that to ideas about aesthetics and critical thinking beyond computing. I know that's a big question.
Good question. I mean, do you want to start? Sorry, no. I didn't mean to cut you off. I mean, I think there. Okay, so I think so many things about this question, and I will try to keep my thoughts straight, which I'm having a hard time doing. I think probably because it's a bit late here, but yeah. So I think that the way that we're thinking through melt and working with melting is inherently non-neutral, right? So I think also the beginning of what it is that we were talking about with messes and mess making, like who has the privilege to make a mess and what does it mean to be a mess at something? This is not an equally distributed thing. And this is also not equally distributed in melting. One theorist that we came to quite early in thinking through this is Denise Vieira da Silva. And she, her text is Towards a Global Idea of Race is quite amazing and very, like opening on this, but one text that we've been reading or been thinking with is called On Heat. And in this, she talks about how literally with melting, the global climate change, capitalism, and colonialism become clearly linked through the reality of heat, right? And so the non-neutrality of melting, I think, is something that has been very clear to us from the beginning. And also, as a proposition of thinking through state change. This is something that Black feminist thinkers specifically, like Octavia Butler, like Denise Ferreira da Silva, like Alexis Pauline Gumbs, have been thinking with and through for a long time. And it's very much about how understanding what change makes possible, right? So I think that the interest in the project is actually the tension of both of these things. And I think that there isn't a kind of like solutionism that we're bringing to Melt, although we do have a pun about that. But yeah, do you want to say some more? Or
About the pun?
About the pun? Yeah, it's a good pun.
So I think because we both work in, like with technology at least,
yeah.
And there's this notion of technofixes,
Mm-hmm.
or the idea that you can fix anything really with technology, even climate change,
Mm-hmm.
or like social inequalities.
Mm-hmm.
So we have been like sort of cooking on chemical solutions,
Mm-hmm.
which actually hold difference and don't necessarily resolve. So in, I think, claiming this sort of solution for social problems,
Mm-hmm.
Ecological issues, etc., that has really also helped us
Mm-hmm.
think with these, and to also like stay with it and not move to the next step where everything is like can be explained with 3 sentences and
Mm-hmm.
it will be fine. Yeah.
Does that tie into your interest in pedagogy and making workshops as a part of your collaboration?
I think the part about open-endedness certainly does. So whenever we meet a group and work together, like of course we come up with some prompts or ideas. So we've been working with warm-ups, for example, where people had to get as hot as possible in 7 minutes. And yet the things people come up with, or like in these conversations or storytelling things, are like we cannot predict them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say they are also open to change, open to people's ideas very much,
Mm-hmm.
and also develop their unique shapes through that. Yeah. So in that sense, I would say, pedagogy, like specifically critical pedagogy, is really important for practice.
Yeah. I would echo that. I could say something more. I mean, so in my very terrible what am I doing from the beginning of this talk, when I was feeling quite tongue-tied, what I should have said is that I work a lot in critical pedagogy, and so this is like a major research focus for me, which also, like, I've been very inspired by the ways in which critical thinking and critical pedagogy have been linked through thinkers like bell hooks, we could say. And so a lot of what I've been inspired by within her texts is really thinking about how social change can be possible and what types of modes do we need to think through social change. And so that often means not accepting the form that has been given, and playing with it and leaving it kind of open-ended so that people can actually meet you. So I think that that is very present with all of the work that Izzy and I do, and I think that I do as well. Yeah.
I was thinking, especially in relationship to like this last, the final sequence in the video is a sequence of this kind of like modernist Lego castle being melted. I was thinking about the relationship between, it's now thundering near me, so apologies if you hear that, but the relationship between aesthetics and modeling, like whether you come to aesthetics as a way of modeling behavior, or even like modeling a proposition, right? Like aesthetics, as opposed to something which is purely visual or purely something for reflection, can give one cues for how to interact or how to ask a question or how to propose an idea, as opposed to how to behold or how to reflect or how to Does that make any sense? I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to art, or if that's even applicable.
Like, for me, aesthetics are deeply structural.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in our work, it's never that we say, hey, we would like to have this one result on the screen, but rather that we ask ourselves what kind of material transformations would be, like, from which could we learn? Mm-hmm. What would be interesting to figure out? What kind of figures can come from there? Mm-hmm. So I think our work, like aesthetic work, is not, of course, what can be seen in the end on the screen, but it's like how we set up our thinking, what, like, which thinkers do we invite to, like, to our, I don't know, collaboration. Yeah. How do we set it up? Mm-hmm. What our expectations are, mm-hmm. etc.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, even what materials might occur to us to work with as well. Yeah.
Yeah, like for me, this question of how this relates to art is also quite interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I think as more of a design position, I'm more into the structural, I don't know, groundwork. But I think as an artist, you would also say that.
Yeah, yeah. I guess as an artist, I guess I also feel like, I guess my responsibilities within the work that we're doing lay in the ways that we are setting up the experimentations that we're doing and how it is that we are framing it conceptually. So, and then this framework that we're working with is significantly more important to me than the image, perhaps, that that comes out of it. So I think there are, like Izzy and I both have trained as in the arts. So I think that there are artistic frameworks that we are working within as well, obviously. But the questions that I think that feel urgent don't feel to me, and I think to us, to come from like the world of art. Like I do think that we are playing with that for sure. I guess, do you want to talk about the black box?
You can talk. It seems like you really want to talk about the black box.
I really want to talk about the black box. So like black box algorithms is something that maybe some people have heard about. There's also like the black square, right? Like a kind of symbol of modernist art, right? And so I'm thinking a lot about how Malevich's work. And so I'm thinking a lot about like, what would it be to enact a different process upon that? So we're working on melting it as opposed to reinstating it. And so I think that it's also like the question of aesthetics is really like, what kinds of processes do we set up to propose and otherwise with these so-called stable forms that we're playing with? So
yeah.
We
have a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm going to ask those, and also ask Flo and Kelly if you have questions. Now is a good time. But Nancy wanted to ask Nancy asks, is messiness or melting different from entropy? And how might this connect to notions of enmorph, which is spelled ENMORPHE, enmorphe, or enmorphing? Nancy, I don't know if I messed that up, but
I'm not familiar with enmorphe or enmorphing or is it morphology maybe? Are you?
No.
No.
Only as in morphing, shape-shifting.
Shape-shifting, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe then we can consider the first part of the question, which is just, is messing or melting different from entropy?
Yeah. And entropy would be defined as like when things will go to chaos or things will go to mess over time, like inevitably. And is melting or mess making different than that?
We haven't been thinking about entropy as much.
No.
So I think like about melting, we've mostly researched chemical processes. So how something from a stable state, for example, liquefies or melts. Yeah.
Or also how things that are melting continue melting, like, or continue changing state or refuse stability, which leads me to think might be close to entropy, but I would like to look more into what entropy means before I make the correlation so clear.
Yeah, I guess about like releasing energy and energy maintaining in systems in regards to the melting of the ice caps, etc., is something we have also been talking about, but not when we burned labor houses yet.
Yeah.
And Michael wants to know, Michael Marcel wanted to ask, or is asking, says, I don't know, my words are also garbled now, but it's interesting to hear you talk about structural aesthetics as leading the work, because he personally finds that there's a lot of beauty in the work. Is the idea of beauty something that you think about at all?
Yes. Definitely. Whenever I think about beauty, I think about Elaine Scarry's On Beauty and Being Just, which is something I haven't thought about actually in a long time, and maybe not in relationship to this work, but it is something that I think I carry with me. But I think it's not something that Izzy and I have really discussed so much. Like, what is our relationship to beauty?
And I think we clearly share a fascination for melting things.
Yeah.
And like, if you want to
like
call that
beauty
or fascination, or magnificence, or sometimes also really ugly, I suppose. But but we also enjoy composing imagery or playing with shape. But also I would say structural is also quite beautiful. So like structures generally, but like how structures are set up.
And making our own structures, I think, is one of the more beautiful things that I'm interested in our project. So
and Bill Leafy, otherwise known as Caroline Chandler, asks, are you researching chaos theory? They ask because they wonder if there's research in that realm of science on melting.
Currently, we're not researching chaos theory, right? I haven't been.
Not explicitly.
I don't think we have. No, not explicitly. But thank you for the tip, Bill Leafy, aka Caroline.
Although I feel like, I mean, I still remember, like, it's one of these conversations that's like burned in my memory as something that I perpetually have to do more research on that I really don't know how to, is when Goda Klumbite, did I say that right? No.
Klumbite, but
okay,
close.
Klumbite, who's Loren's partner, was explaining quantum computing to me, and I was like, stop, my world has been changed, but I really have no idea what you're talking about. Like, I think probably quantum computing and chaos theory, as it like relates to quantum mechanics, probably have some relationship with one another, right? I don't know, that's just an extrapolation, but
I'm not sure. As I understand quantum computing, like one of the aims is finding unbreakable encryption, like creating that, like basically unbreakable. Whereas chaos theory, I guess, relates to the interconnectedness of things and the effects small changes can make. But I would be really interested about connections. It could also be that I haven't really thought these together ever before. So it's definitely interesting to think about that further.
Oh, and Morph, Nancy Goldring follows up and says, and Morph is a book by Rosalind Krauss and Eveline Bois, as a postmodern, it's in Morph as a postmodern condition. So, yeah, I mean, I also just like really briefly, and maybe this is a good point to open it up because I'm just going to start making random comments about structuralism now. But it seems to me actually that it's like the way that you structure this argument, again, in terms of states of matter, agents of change, and also structural aesthetics, seems to be a kind of precondition for understanding terms, right? Which the dictionary also falls into, but that like the fact of melting, the video blend, right? The idea of melting as either an antidote or in opposition to deconstruction as a critical theory seems to be profoundly unstructural in terms of how things are remixed, or how things are how associations are unmade, even if like where you land, even if in the liquid state, like you can still see something as its structure. It would seem, I don't know, maybe this is off base. I'm gonna let people unmute themselves now and we can maybe just have a conversation. And thank you all so much for joining us and sharing your ideas. Yeah, I don't know, maybe I'm totally off base here too.
No, like also thank you for all of your great questions.
Yeah.
And the nice conversation.
Yeah.
Always fun.
It's fabulous to be here with y'all.
Yay.